Okay, we're live. We'll get started if y'all are ready. We are in Ezekiel chapter 22. We've got two more in the judgment on Israel section. It goes chapter 22 and then chapter 23. And chapter 23 is, again, judgment on the nation of Israel or Judah. And then starting in chapter 24, he starts talking more about judgment on foreign countries, foreign nations. But so we got two more on the punishment of Israel. And God is really going to a lot of detail, telling them what they did wrong, why he's punishing them, what the results will be, what the consequences are. And so now he's going to go... He's going to take chapter 22 a little bit further in chapter 21, and he's going to tell us that the reason for the sword coming, and you remember chapter 21 was all about a history of their disobedience, and that the sword was coming, God was going to judge them, and he's going to use Babylon to do it. Now he's going to give us one of the primary reasons that they're judged, one of the primary reasons. And the reason that he tells us in chapter 22 is going to be because of the sins of the leaders, the present generation. And so what we went through is this history of rebellion, and God's talking about their past. You know, this is what you were in the past, is how it was. And so they have a tendency to sit back and think, well, we're not as bad as they were. Now chapter 22 is all about what they're doing, present generation, the Judahites, the people of Judah, what their sins are. And they are it's very consistent throughout their judgment period, especially when we start talking about chapter 22 and 23, because you're going to see some common themes that run through them. But in chapter 22, it's about present day, the leadership. Chapter 20, again, was about the past. Now it's the guilt of the present. And so in chapter 22, he's going to give us basically three messages, three indictments, and really they're going to read as we read through this. It's going to almost read like a courtroom scene where Ezekiel is the prosecutor. God is telling him what the charges are. Ezekiel's reading them out, and so it's like this prosecutorial kind of scenario. And they're going to fall into two broad categories. So you're going to have three different episodes or three events, three categories. But they're going to be in two broad categories. The first category is going to be sins against God. And so he's going to talk to them about what is going to be what we'll call spiritual apostasy. And he's going to say, one of the reasons you guys are being judged is because you've committed sins directly against God. That's the first four commandments of the Decalogue. And then he's going to say the second reason you guys are being judged is because you're committing sins against each other. And you're going to see it in here. It's kind of what we'd call social injustice. And so basically what he's going to say is, you people have broken both sections of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. You broke the section that's referring to your relationship with God. You just, idolatry and those kinds, you just blew that out of the water. And then that second table of the Decalogue, where it talks about how to get along with each other, he said, you smashed it too. You're not doing it. So Ezekiel is going to now lay out a case. And he's going to say, this is the unfaithfulness, the covenant unfaithfulness that has got you into the shape where now you're going to be judged by Babylon. All right, so look at verse 1 in chapter 22. Because the first 16 verses are just that. It's about the covenant unfaithfulness. Why Israel's unfaithful. Verse 1, then the word of the Lord came to me saying, and you, son of man, will you judge? Will you judge the bloody city? And that's important. He's going to use that multiple times, as a matter of fact. I think it's 7. Then cause her to know all her abominations. You shall say, thus saith the Lord God, a city shedding blood in her midst, so that her time will come, and it makes idols, contrary to her interest, for defilement. So, again, God sends a message to Ezekiel. This is how these are oracles or messages of judgment. And they all start with God sending a message directly to Ezekiel. Son of man, this is what you tell the people. All right, that's an oracle of judgment. And so look at why he calls Jerusalem. He says, to that bloody city. It's a bloody city. And the reason he calls it bloody city is because this is all about their abominations and the things that they're doing. And he's going to give us some specific sins. But basically he's saying, because of your actions, it's caused a lot of harm to people. Matter of fact, the Hebrew word for blood is dam, D-A-M, or damim, bloody. And it's 7 times in this section that word comes up. And every time the connotation for it, or the nuance that it's couched in, is always harming somebody else. You're hurting somebody else. And so when God sends Ezekiel this message or this oracle, and he says, say to this bloody city, what he's saying is, this city that's caused a lot of harm. It's just hurt people. It's not treated each other well. You've not took care of each other, and it's just a mess. And so this shedding of blood is going to be their primary offense. Right? That's the primary thing God has a problem with. And again, we've looked at this through the first 21 chapters. It all has to do with idolatry. Israel, Judah, Jerusalem is a city that's God's city, God's people. And God has set them apart. God said, I'm going to deliver you out. And he's went through this whole history, and he said, you guys are like a baby that was cast out. Nobody wanted. I took you in. I raised you. I treated you right, gave you everything. Then you married into the royal family, as it were. And I gave you jewels. I gave you clothes. I gave you a place to live, all this nice food. And then you guys went out and committed spiritual adultery on me. And so it's all, I mean, God has had his hand on these people since day one. Now, he says, one of your primary offenses, one of your primary sins, is that you've tried to be like everybody else. And so all these surrounding countries, they're doing things, and for some reason you think that's cool to do, so you're doing them too. You're bringing them into God's holy city, and you're perverting and defiling the whole thing. And one of them is blood. And when he talks about this blood, one of the things that other countries were doing, that Israel started doing, was human sacrifice, especially in babies. And so God said, I've kind of got a problem with you on this, because you're not you're not focused just on who I am and letting me be your God anymore. You're branching outside of that, and you're adopting all these pagan practices. So that's what he means in those first 2 verses. It's a bloody city because they're disregarding human life. They just don't care. And think about this. Look at our history in America. Look at or the world, the modern day world. Look at where we're at. And it's even worse now, but in the 18th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher, came along, and he promoted this idea that God is dead. God's just dead. And so this philosophy came worldwide that said you don't have to believe in God, it doesn't matter, nobody cares, that kind of thing. That's the 18th century. The 19th century, the 1800s, they came along with this philosophy, and they said, okay, if God is dead, if we don't ever believe in God, then the Bible doesn't matter. And so we'll kind of throw out the Bible. We don't listen to it. We're not going to live by its precepts. We're not going to follow its commandments. And so it's just this kind of Bibleless society. The 20th century came along, and watch what we've done. And we're not just out, well, we are in some regard, but if God is dead, and then if the Bible is dead, in the 20th century, we said people don't matter. If God doesn't matter and the Bible doesn't matter, people don't matter. So what do? We legalized abortion and those kind of things, and we're just treating people like they don't even matter, like they're not important anymore. So we're kind of following the footsteps of ancient Israel. We're doing what they did. That Ezekiel had to pass a judgment oracle on them from God. All right, so look at verse 3 now. These are God's words to them. You shall say, thus saith the Lord God, a city shedding blood in her midst, so that her time will come, and that makes idols contrary to her interest for defilement. You have become guilty by the blood which you have shed, and defiled by your idols which you have made. Thus you have brought your day near, and come to your years. Therefore I have made you a reproach to the nations and a mocking to all the land. So he says, God says, I regard you, Jerusalem, as a city that has shed blood in the midst, in its city. It's not a war for you're defending your honor or defending your territory. You're just shedding blood unrighteously. And he says, you're doing it because you've crafted idols. You're starting to follow idols. And because you're following idols, look at what he says in verse 3. You make idols that go contrary to your interest. In other words, you're doing things that's not in your self-interest. You're making these idols, and you're following these idols that cannot help you, that cannot listen to you, they can't hear you, they can't help you. And I, on the other hand, as God, can hear you, will listen to you, can help you, but you're not listening to me. So you're doing things that are contrary to what's better for you. You're not even looking out for your own best interest. Then look what he says, because this is what happens when a people in a country turn on God. God said, I'm going to make you a reproach and a source of mockery to all those people around you. All those countries basically are going to make fun of you, and they're going to mock you because of the judgment that's coming and because of what you've done. All right, so now look at verse 6. Behold, the rulers of Israel, each according to his power, have been in you for the purpose of shedding blood. And this is where he's going to divide this out. He's talking about the leaders or the rulers, and he's going to give us three. Some scholars say 4 categories, and it could be, and I'll tell you why it could be, because one of the Hebrew words is, I think, probably translated wrong. But he's going to give us 3 or 4 categories of rulers. So in verse 6, he says, now the rulers of Israel, the leadership, each according to his power, in other words, each in his area, what he's in charge of, each in his area, have been in you, or been inciting you, been encouraging you or leading you to shed blood. Each one of them in their sphere of authority have led you astray. All right, so he says, now I'm going to judge those people. All right, so look at verse 7 through 9 and see if this sounds familiar. They have treated father and mother lightly within you. The alien they've oppressed in your midst. The fatherless and the widow they have wronged in you. You've despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths. Slanderous men have been in you for the purpose of shedding blood. And in you they have eaten at the mountain shrines. In your midst they have committed acts of lewdness. So look how he breaks this first little part down. First of all, the leadership. We're talking about leaders now. These are, and I'll give you the specific categories of them. But the leaders have undermined the parental authority. Look at what he says in verse 6. Verse 7. They've treated father and mother lightly within you. That's an idiomatic phrase that means they've undermined the parental authority. Your mom and daddy say one thing, the leader's telling you to do the opposite. They're not helping the parental authority any. Here's I really believe it. When children stop respecting their parents, it's not going to be long until they stop respecting everybody else. You know, the authorities, the governments, the laws. You know, once they stop respecting their parents, then it's all lost. Then look what he says. They've taken advantage of the helpless people. This is what he means. Look at the categories. These are the helpless, the aliens, the immigrants. People say Christians are anti-immigrant or Republicans are anti-immigrant, but we're not anti-immigrant. We want to treat immigrants right. We just want them to do it legally. And if they do it legally, it will help. You know, we're there for them. But he's saying, you as a country, when these aliens come in, you're taking advantage of them. Then look what he says. It's the alien, and then he says the fatherless, the widows, those orphans widows, those people who need societal protection more than anybody else are being taken advantage of by the rulers. And God says, I got a problem with that. And that's part of the reason you guys are going to be judged. He said, it's not just something you did in the past. This is not back in Moses' time. This is right now in your time. Is what you guys are doing. You're taking advantage of people, and it's going to get worse. To me, one of the true test of the goodness of a society is how the society treats the helpless in its midst. And this is what I say, and I'm gonna make an indictment here against us that you may or may not agree with, I don't know. But the Bible never calls for the government to do social welfare. That's not a biblical mandate. It's a church mandate. God's called the church to take care of those people. The church to take care of the orphans, the church to take care of the widows, the church to take care of those who can't help themselves. That's our calling. And over the years, somehow, the church has reneged on that and backed down from it and turned it over to the government. And now it gets out of hand. That's the church's responsibility. And this is what he's talking about with Israel. He said, one of the things that I have against you people is the most vulnerable in your society. You're not taking care of them. As a matter of fact, not only are you not taking care of them, you're taking advantage of them. And God said, it's one of the reasons you're going to be judged. Then look what he says. You've despised holy things, worship, and you've profaned the Sabbath. The leaders, he said, the leaders has despised what God has considered holy. The temple, for one. God had them erect this temple, and they brought a pagan idol and put it inside the front door of the temple. God said, you've despised the things that I treat as holy. Those things that I count as holy and sacred and set apart, you guys have profaned that and taken advantage of that. And he said, you're not even taking advantage of the Sabbath. You're not honoring that the way it was set up. Then look, because it gets worse. He says, slanderous men have been in you for the purpose of shedding blood. When he says has been in you, that's a Hebrew idiom, and it means they have manipulated you. They've got inside your mind and caused you to do these things. When it says shedding blood, he's talking about premeditated murder. He said they've got inside you, and you've detested the holy things. You've perverted my system of justice. You are profaning the Sabbath, not taking it holy. And then you just start killing each other for no reason. You just premeditated murder. And then he goes a step further and says the leaders even are worshiping in those shrines. I told you high places or mountain places are idol worship. It's referring to idol worship. So he says, your leaders have even went to these idols. Then look, here's one of the common themes, and chapter 23 is real heavy on this, but look at because he's going to give examples. Look at verse 9. Slanderous men have been in you for the purpose of shedding blood. They've eaten at the mountain shrines. In your midst, they have committed acts of lewdness. This is sexual sin. Ritual sex, this whole idea was a great attraction for idolatry. Anytime you read about idolatry in the ancient Near East, it always involves this sexual content to it. And so this is what pagan countries did, especially with two gods. They worshiped the god Baal, who was the pagan god of fertility, and they worshipped Ashereth, who is the pagan goddess of fertility. And so ancient people believed that all things came into being because of a sexual act. All right? People, animals, plants, whatever. And so they believed, matter of fact, I want to read you something because God addressed this specifically because he knew they were going to be doing this stuff. Listen to what these Levitical laws, these are, sometimes they don't make a lot of sense until you look at why they were made in the first place. But listen to this law in Leviticus chapter 19. God says, you're to keep my statutes, my laws. You shall not breed together two kinds of your cattle. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor wear a garment upon you with two kinds of material mixed together. So God specifically gave them a law and said, don't breed two different kinds of animals, and don't breed two different kinds of seeds in the field. Because these ancient Near Eastern people believed that what was born into being, and that's animals, plants, people, everything, what was born into being started because of a sexual relationship or a sexual act between the gods, specifically Baal and Ashereth. And so they believed that when they worshipped, when these pagan people went into worship centers, one of the things they did was have sexual relationships with a temple prostitute. And so all these ladies were given a job of being a prostitute at the pagan temples. So you're just sitting there waiting on people to come by and worship. And when people come by to worship, they engage in sexual acts with these temple prostitutes. Because the ancient Near East, and that sounds really weird to us, but it's a cornerstone of their belief system. And so they believe that if you go to worship at a temple and you engage with a temple prostitute, then that act encourages the gods to engage in a sexual relationship. And when the gods engage in a sexual relationship, then more cattle are born, more plants come up, the babies are born healthy, and everything's right in the world. That's what the pagans were doing. God said, don't do that. Don't get involved in that. Israel in Ezekiel's day were doing that. They were visiting temple prostitutes, and they were honoring all these pagan rituals of fertility. And God said in Ezekiel, part of this oracle of judgment, God said, that's one of the main things I have against you, is because I've told you to be separate. I've told you to be consecrated. I've told you to be sexually pure. And you guys have perverted all that. You know, it's crazy stuff. And so you're going to be judged for it. That's what he's talking about here. Now, he's going to give specifics. Look at verse 10. In you they have uncovered their father's nakedness. In you they have humbled her who was unclean in her menstrual impurity. One has committed abomination with his neighbor's wife, and another has lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law, and another in you has humbled his sister, his father's daughter. So look at the categories: sexual impurity, adultery, outside and inside the family. He said you're going out having adultery with your neighbor's wife. You're also having affairs with your kinfolk, your daughter-in-law, which is adultery outside of that. And then he says you're even having affairs with your sister. So he's talking about incest. And so he says you guys have taken this sexual perversion to a whole new level. He said, it's not just temple prostitutes that you're engaged in. He said, you guys are committing all kind of sexual impurity, including adultery outside and inside the family and incest. He says, so that's, in other words, moral purity in this time period in Israel had completely broken down. There's no morals. Sound familiar with 21st century America? There's no morals here. People are just doing whatever they think is right. Now, he's going to get away from that topic in verse 12. Look at verse 12. In you they have taken bribes to shed blood. That's basically hiring a hitman. Bribes to kill people. So he said you're paying people to kill people. You've taken interest in profits. And when he says that, you've taken interest in profits, and you have injured your neighbors for gain by oppression. In other words, you're making interest in profit at the expense of your neighbor. You're hurting them. There's nothing wrong with making a profit, but it's entirely wrong when you make a profit to the extent that you're hurting somebody else in doing it. Think price gouging and that kind of stuff. That's what he's talking about here. And then he says, look at the last part of verse 12. And you have forgotten me. So the worst part of all this is the Jerusalemites those people that are still in Jerusalem, especially the leadership, they just forgot who God was. He kind of took a secondary backseat, and they're doing everything according to the pagan nations. So God said, I'm judging you for that. Look at verse 13. And again, this is more examples of what's wrong. Verse 13, behold then, I smite my hand at your dishonest gain, which you have acquired, and at the bloodshed which is among you. Verse 14, can your heart endure, or can your hands be strong in the days that I will deal with you? I, the Lord, have spoken and will act. Now, this is verse 13. He's talking about financial corruption and physical violence that had escalated in Jerusalem. Look at verse 13. Look at the way he words this. Behold then, I smite my hand at you. That's what we call anthropomorphism. That's putting human characteristics on God. And what God says is, I don't know if God has hands like we do or not, but when he says, I smite my hand at you, it's God doing this, pounding his fist into his palm. That's the anthropomorphic idiom that phrase is talking about. God said, it makes me just angry. I smack my hand at you. And so look at what he says in 13 and 14. Because you have greatly disturbed me, because you really got off track, you really delved into this sin, I just want to hit my hand. I'm angry. It's God angry. All right, now jump down to verse 15, because now God's going to promise them something. And he's going to promise them basically two things, or three things. Number one, I will scatter you among the nations. So he says, I promise I'm going to scatter the people of Jerusalem among other nations, disperse them among other lands. That's what we call a diaspora, where the Jews just are scattered all over the place. God said, one of the things I'm going to do, because you guys are so disobedient, because you're all here together, and you're plotting evil against me, you're plotting idolatry and all that, I'm going to scatter you out. You're not going to be around each other anymore. Number two, he says, look, I will consume your uncleanliness from you. That is, when he says it, he means I'm going to refine you. Your sinful practices, I'm going to refine those. And then he's going to go into more detail on that a little bit later. But look at verse 14 then. He says, you'll profane yourself in the sight of the nations, and you will know that I am the Lord. The third thing he says, when you go out, look the way he words it, he says, you will profane yourself in the sight of other nations. In other words, I'm going to scatter you out. You're going to be scattered all over the place, and you will not maintain your holiness while you're in exile. You're going to be an embarrassment. You're going to be ridiculed. You're going to be mocked, because you're not going to be able to put on two faces. You're going to be the real you out there. They're going to see it. All right. So now he says in verse 17, that's all the accusations. So far it's been all accusation. Now we're going to get to the actual judgment. Look what he says in verse 17, because this is where it gets rough for them. Verse 17 through 20. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, the house of Israel has become dross to me. All of them are bronze and tin and iron and lead. In the furnace they are the dross of silver. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, because all of you have become dross, therefore, behold, I am going to gather you into the midst of Jerusalem, as they gather silver and bronze and iron and lead and tin into the furnace to blow fire on it, in order to melt it. So I will gather you in my anger and in my wrath. I will lay you there and melt you. All right, so this is what he's talking about. He says, I'm comparing the present day Jerusalemites, those people living right there in Jerusalem. He says, you guys are like the base metals that are melted out when we refine silver. And he names a couple of them, like lead, sulfur, tin, other kind of metals. That's called the dross. And so when they refine silver, silver is the valuable part. So when they refine silver, they got all this metal together. They put it in a furnace. They set it on fire and they melt it. And they separate out the dross or the bad stuff, the unvaluable, the cheap stuff, the worthless stuff, the tin, all that. Separate it out, and then they're left with the valuable silver. God said to those Jerusalemites, you guys are like that leftover stuff. You're the dross. And he says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put you in a giant melting pot, which is the city of Jerusalem, and I'm going to melt you with fire. And I'm going to separate out. I'm going to judge you. I'm going to refine you. That's one of the things he promised them. I'm going to refine you from your sinful practices. I'm going to get it out of you. And so now he says, I'm going to put you in this great big melting pot, the city of Jerusalem, and we're going to heat it up and separate the good from the bad. And that's actually literally what happens. When Babylon comes in, they set the whole city on fire. And he actually burns the city of Jerusalem just like God promised them that he was going to do. And so, to me, I'm thinking it's pretty bad when God compares you, your worth or your value to the leftover junk that nobody wants. That's what he told them. You're so far off that I'm going to have to do this in order to purify you. I've got to burn out those impurities. I've got to burn out that sin. I've got to burn out those iniquities. I've got to burn out that idolatry. I've got to melt all that stuff away so that I can get you back to a pure form that you're supposed to be. That's God's chastisement. Remember I told you, God never does anything for punitive correction. It's not that God just wants to hurt us. When God judges us or purifies us like this, it's always for a restorative purpose. He wants to bring us back. He wants to get the sin out of our life. And sometimes, to be quite honest with you, there's the sin where we're holding so tight to the sin that God has to take drastic steps to get it out. And so this is what he's talking about here. You guys are involved in this. So God says, I'm going to judge you. I'm going to purify you. Then look at verse 21. I will gather you and blow on you with the fire of my wrath. You'll be melted in the midst of it. As silver is melted in a furnace, so you be melted in the midst of it. And you will know that I, the Lord, have poured out my wrath on you. So God said, I'm going to do it. And because I do it, you're going to know that I did it. And everybody's going to know that I did it. All right. Now, get to verse 22, or verse 23, and it kind of starts one of the second section, and this is where he's going to identify the leaders. So far, it's been a general statement about your leadership has done this, your leaders have done that. Now he's going to specifically identify the leaders. Look at verse 23 and 24. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, say to her, you are a land that is not cleansed or rained on in the day of indignation. Her is Jerusalem or Israel. Son of man, say to her, you are a land that is not cleansed or rained on. So God says, I'm going to withhold rain because of your covenant disobedience. I'm going to hold back the rain from you. Their moral uncleanliness, their penchant for sin has accumulated because they had not yet benefited from God's cleansing. So now God says, I'm going to cleanse you because you're just getting too far off. Now, verse 25, here's the specific. There is a conspiracy of her prophets in her midst, like a roaring lion tearing the prey. They have devoured lives. They have taken treasure and precious things. They have made many widows in the midst of her. And so this is at 3, maybe 4 categories of leaders that God points out. The first, look at verse 25, among her prophets. And we're talking about false prophets. These are false prophets. Does any translation, any of y'all have a Bible that instead of prophet it says prince? Yeah. Some of them say prince. That's a bad translation. The Hebrew word is nebiyeha, which is prophet. And so he's actually, because he's talking about princes later. And that's why I say it could be 4 different categories of people. But he says, it's your false prophets. Your false prophets I'm judging. Because look what they've done. They've eaten up people's lives. and stolen their possessions, and God compares them to a lion. God said, this lion has went out, and this lion has devoured its prey. He said, that's the way your false prophets are. They're claiming to be true prophets. They're claiming to be real, but they're leading you into destruction. And here's what they're doing. And it's where you have to, when you look at the whole Bible, and in Bible interpretation, Bible hermeneutic, the key thing is the Bible always interprets itself. And so you see what else the Bible says about it. So here's where they're leading people astray. These prophets in Jerusalem, who are actually false prophets, are telling people, let's stand up against the Babylonians. We can defeat these guys. You know, I know God says they're coming in, but we got an army too, and we're just as good as they are. And so these prophets are going out to all these houses and having these public meetings and everything, and they're saying to all these men, young men, boys, they're saying, hey, y'all get up, grab your sword, go out there and let's fight the Babylonians as they come. And so what happened was a lot of these young men and granddaddies and whoever could fight were going out there and getting killed by the droves, by the Babylonians. That's why he says, you guys are like lions. You're devouring your prey. Because they're telling them, you go out, you fight, God's going to give you victory. And that was the key. They're assuring these people that God's going to deliver them. Oh, God's got you. God, you're God's people. God's not going to let you die. You know, you're going to be, and then they're dying by it. And they're leaving a lot of widows. That's what he says. A lot of orphans, because they're dying out there. Now, read the rest of the prophecies in the Bible. Jeremiah is prophesying at the same time. And Jeremiah is telling those people, stay right where you're at, give in to the Babylonians, go into exile, don't resist, God has a plan. You know, it may take a while, but God's going to deliver us. And so you got Jeremiah, the true prophet, telling them to don't fight, just give in. And then you got these false prophets saying, go out here and fight, and they're all dying because of it. And so God says, you tell those prophets that they're like lions and they're tearing their prey. They're devouring lives. And the leaders in Jerusalem, when these men go out and fight, the leaders are going in and getting all their stuff. Well, he's dead. He's not coming back. He don't need that stuff. So they're going in their houses and raiding all their stuff and leaving their widows and their children destitute. And God says, you're going to be judged for that. That's not the way we conduct ourselves. All right, so that's category number one, false prophets. Look at verse 26. Her priests. So category number two is priest. Her priests have done violence to my law and have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the profane. They have not taught the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they hide their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them. So the priests abused the Mosaic law. It's what he's talking about by profaning the holy thing. They're not taking it seriously. And here's the big thing. Look what he says here. They're making no distinction between holy and profane. In other words, they're treating as common what God has consecrated. The things that God set apart, like temple furnishings, the Sabbath, worship, the Ten Commandments, Decalogue, the Mosaic Law, what God has set apart and said, this is special, this is consecrated, the priests are just treating it like nothing. They just don't care. And so God said, because of that, they're going to get judged. Verse 27, 28, her princes within her are like wolves tearing the prey by shedding blood and destroying lives in order to get dishonest gain. Her prophets have smeared whitewash for them, seeing false visions and divining lies for them, saying, thus says the Lord God, when the Lord has not spoken. So you get that? The princes, when he says princes, he means nobles. Those of noble birth, you know, those high class people. And he says they're abusing the people to get what they want. And so they don't care about the people. They don't care about anything. They're going out and they're behaving kind of like the description he uses, wild wolves. They're just going out and just taking advantage of people. And then what makes it worse is these false prophets are backing them up. So these leaders, they got this little business going on. You know, the noblemen are like, let's get them in a war, because if we get in a war, we'll get all their stuff. We'll have more power and more stuff, and we'll get rid of these troublemakers. And so then these false prophets are coming in saying, oh yeah, they're right. God said go fight. And look what he says in verse 28, when God did not speak. God did not say that. But these false prophets are telling them they did. And so the princes and the prophets are working together to deceive people. And so God, he's going to be tired of it. Now look at verse 29. Because now here's where I consider the other group of people. The people of the land have practiced oppression and committed robbery, and they have wronged the poor and needy and have oppressed the sojourner without justice. This is ordinary people. He's talking about prophets. He's talking about the princes or the nobles. And then he's talking about the ordinary people. And he says, even the non-nobles are taking advantage of each other. They're stealing from each other is what he's saying. They're taking advantage of the poor. They're taking advantage of the needy. They're taking advantage of the traveler, the sojourner that's coming in. And they don't even care. And so it trickled down from the leadership down to the people. Then verse 30. I searched for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand in the gap. If that sounds familiar, that's exactly what Nehemiah preached to the people. God said, I searched for a man among them who would build up the wall, stand in the gap before me for the land, so that I would not destroy it. But I found no one. God said, I looked for one of the Judahites. Israel's in the north. Judah's the southern kingdom. Jerusalem is the capital of Judah in the south. Samaria is the capital of Israel in the north. Now he's talking about Judah, the southern kingdom. And he says, in this whole land, God said, I searched for one guy that would stand in the gap and deliver the people, and I didn't find anybody. Now, that's probably hyperbole. It's probably an exaggeration for effect. Because, if you think about it, here we are in the 580s, and there's got to be one righteous guy in Jerusalem. It has to be one. It's kind of like when Moses interceded for Sodom. It's got to be one. Or when Abraham interceded for Sodom, it's got to be one person. I think what God is saying here is that, because think about it, there's people that are faithful to the Lord. Habakkuk's here, Jeremiah's here. They're all prophesying, and they're righteous people. So God can find one. But what God is saying is that there's even those faithful guys were not enough to stem the tide of the coming judgment, because it had gotten so bad that God said it's almost like nobody's listening, and so judgment has to come. Even the true prophets, the ones that are being faithful, can't do enough. It's just like Abraham. And I'm sure when Ezekiel is making this little prophecy, he's probably thinking about Abraham standing up and saying, God, if you find 50 righteous people, will you spare Sodom? And he worked it all the way down to 10. And God was saying, yeah, I'll do that. And so look at verse 30. A man among them who would build the wall and stand in the gap. Moses had been a gap man in his day. That's what Moses was. Moses was the guy that turned aside God's wrath when God wanted to destroy the Israelites, because Moses interceded for them. Moses was that guy. And this is what he's talking about. It's what Nehemiah was talking about physically and spiritually. But God said, I need one guy. In this case, what he's really saying is, I need some faithful servants who will intercede on behalf of everybody else. I need some prayer warriors. The New Testament says the fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. That's kind of what he's talking about. I need people that stand in the gap. I need people that will say, I'm going to be faithful, and I'm going to intercede for my city and my country that's not so faithful. I'll be the one that stands in the gap. That's what God's looking for. God's looking for me and you to stand in the gap and be that person. And then he closes in verse 31. Thus I have poured out my indignation on them. I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath. Their way I have brought upon their heads, declares the Lord God. Because there was nobody to stem the tide, because the judgment was coming, God said, now I'm sending judgment. Look at the wording for this. I'll show you some Hebrew in this. Look at this wording. Thus I have poured out my indignation. Hadn't happened yet. This is a prophecy. This is written in about 592 BC. It didn't happen until about 586 BC. But look at the wording. I have poured out. That is in Hebrew what we call a prophetic perfect tense verb. It's writing the verb in referring to a future action like it's already happened for certain. God said, I've poured out. In other words, nothing's going to stop it. I'm going to refer to something in the future like it's already taken place, because between 592 BC and 586 BC, there's nothing going to stop this judgment from coming. As prophetic perfect tense. It's confusing if you read that, because you read that and you think, well, that's past tense, so maybe this is before the judgment. You get all messed up. But it's a specific verb tense in Hebrew that means something in the future that is written, and it's always from God's perspective, and it's written as if it had already taken place. It's already done. God said, I poured it out. In other words, they're being judged in 6 years. Nothing you can do about it. It's coming. I'm pouring it out on them because of those sins. Now, when we get to chapter 23 next week, it's one more lesson on the unfaithfulness of Israel. But this time he uses two women. He names two women, two sisters, and they represent Israel and Judah, and they're basically prostitutes. And he's going to talk about their sexual promiscuity from an early age on. And but he's using women as the example, but he's going to be talking about the two countries. So any questions or comments about all that? All right, well, I appreciate y'all being here. We'll sign off with our online crowd, and again, invite y'all to come out with us on Wednesday nights and be with us here in person Sunday mornings, 10:15. And we'd love to have you, but I hope you all have a great week.